introduce our guest speaker today. Julie is the Senior Director of External Affairs at KET, President-elect of our club, and also a member of our Speakers Committee. Julie, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Does that sound good, Luke? Do I talk?
Yes.
Okay, great. You never know with these things. Well, our featured speaker is no stranger to unusual and unprecedented times. We're very fortunate to have had her present before our club late last year while in her position as Executive Assistant Director of the Criminal Cyber Response and Services Branch of the Federal Bureau for Investigation. A native of Jeffersonville, Indiana, with a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue University, she served as a special agent with the FBI for nearly 29 years and rose to the highest ranked woman in the federal agency. In her last assignment, Chief Hess reported to the Deputy Director overseeing all the agency's criminal and cyber investigations, international operations, victim services, and critical incident response capabilities across the world. Her full bio and highlights of her fascinating career are in your Sparks newsletter. Retired from the FBI, Amy is now home in Kentucky, and tapped by Mayor Fisher in February 2020, she now serves as the Chief of Public Services for Louisville Metro Government. She started her job just about the time that the coronavirus entered our region. Her responsibilities include oversight of the Louisville Division of Fire, Corrections, Facilities and Fleet, Public Works, Animal Services, and Emergency Services. She, along with her dedicated staff, have been on the front lines, working around the clock to serve and protect throughout this pandemic. We owe a debt of gratitude for their dedication and for her leadership, and I'm honored to welcome Chief Amy Hess to our meeting today. And as Luke said, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter those, and we'll entertain those following her presentation. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's so great to see you all again, even though this time it's a little different from the last time that I had the honor of addressing the group. But thank you, Julie, for the invitation, and just really appreciate the opportunity to just kind of share some of the things that that I've been up to, but also to talk about my new team and my new job with Louisville Metro Government. And I have a presentation to share with you here in just a moment, but as my husband likes to remind me, he said, I thought you were retiring to like ease into something a little bit, a little easier as a retirement job. And clearly this was not it. But who could have predicted the events that have happened here in the world in the past several months? So I would say that, of course, it's an honor to work in public service. And I felt a calling to do that after my FBI career. And I particularly wanted to see how I might be able to do that back home here in Louisville. We kept the house after I was the agent in charge of the FBI office here in Louisville. I went back to headquarters in Washington, D.C. for the fourth time. But my husband said, I'm not going this time. I've moved with you 8 times. I'm going to keep the house here in Louisville, and we'll see you. The dog and I will see you when you get back. And so about 15 months later, I finally retired from the FBI. I moved back home, and I'm glad to say that the house was still in good shape. I checked on it about once a month just to make sure that there weren't shoes and clothes strewn everywhere or open chip bags. But he kept it in good shape, and then of course I got the job with the mayor's office. So in public services, I have responsibility, as Julie said, for a whole variety of things, but most predominantly, and probably what has occupied the biggest piece of my life in the last 4 months since I've had the job, has been emergency management, and I'll get to why that is here in a moment. But the other departments that occupy a lot of time, as you might suspect, would be corrections. So I have responsibility for the Metro Corrections Department, and that's run by Director Dwayne Clark. And in addition to, of course, just dealing with all things COVID related, of course, just the jail overcrowding situation at the beginning of my tenure just 4 months ago, it's taken an interesting turn here over the past several months, and I'll talk about that in a moment. As well as, like I said, emergency management, which includes emergency services, so medical services, as well as 911 and 311. And then my next department, the third department that occupies clearly a lot of time is fire. So the fire department I have responsibility for, and of course, when I first got this job, you may recall that there was a female firefighter who was killed in an auto accident in St. Louis, and it was really a tremendous honor to just see how the fire department, really not just this fire department, but all fire departments came together and really took care of her and her family and brought her back, her and her daughter, and of course their friend and her daughter back here for the respective funerals. So it was very moving to be part of that and just to see that firsthand and how the fire department really bands together, fire departments across the nation really. And then, so those are three of my departments. The fourth department I'll mention is Metro Animal Services, which I gotta say I thought would be a great stress reliever because I would be able to visit the shelter whenever I wanted to and pet the animals. And my husband was mainly concerned that I would bring them home. And I am glad to say I did not do that. But Metro Animal Services got a brand new facility just back in November, just prior to my arrival. They're on Newburgh Road. It's a fantastic facility compared to, I've seen pictures of the old facility and compared to this one, it's pretty amazing. And so if you haven't seen it already, then I encourage you to do that when we can get out and about a little bit more. Again, just a really phenomenal job that was done there by Director Ozzie Gibson and his crew at Metro Animal Services. And then, that's 4 departments. The last 2 departments are Public Works, which is responsible for solid waste management as well as roads. I probably underestimated how much people actually care about those things, but having been a resident of many cities, I should have been aware of that because I tend to complain about the same things everybody else complains about. And now I get to see it on the inside of what all goes into repairing roads or sidewalks or waste management, recycling. I had no idea there were so many rules and laws about these things, and so and ordinances, and so it's been interesting to see all that. And then finally, facilities and fleet, really, which is all the city buildings and also the city vehicles and maintaining all of those things and seeing how all that works and how we go into lease agreements and all those things. Thank goodness I have really smart people who've done this for a long time, who have educated me over the past several months. So, but I really wanted to talk to you today about our COVID response. And so I was in the job about 4 weeks, maybe 3, when all of a sudden we started hearing around the nation that this was becoming a thing. And of course, what we saw originally in Washington State, with particularly with the nursing home there, and really getting everybody's attention. And then as you just started to see, as we all watched on television as to how, and the media, and how this really started to sweep across the nation. And we recognized early on that, okay, we really need to get ahead of this. This is inevitable. This is going to be here, and we need to plan for it. We need to figure out what we're going to do. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen here, if I can. Hopefully y'all can see that, I hope. And let me start my presentation. All right, can you see that okay? Yep, all right. So you'll see down there at the bottom right-hand corner, I can't get my title straight. My title actually was, and I think is today, the Chief of Public Services. It's one of the cabinet level positions in the mayor's office. But last week, I've had conversations with the mayor, and now I am inheriting the police department in addition to my other 6 departments. And so therefore, we're going to change the title from Public Services to Public Safety. I may be losing 1 or 2 of the departments because the police department is, of course, a very large department, has well, let's just say it's in the public light a lot. and particularly now. And so anticipating that's going to require a lot of my time, probably be shifting a few things around. But that's right now, the title looks like I will be the Chief of Public Safety here very shortly. So, so if I could take you back for a moment, back on March 3rd is when the governor issued that initial state of emergency. And back on March 3rd, we kind of knew something was coming, but we weren't 100% sure exactly how it was going to impact Kentucky and what was going to happen. But this is just, and I'll go through a few slides with these executive orders, but these are just a fraction of the executive orders that were issued by the governor and by the mayor and by mayors and governors across the nation to do similar things. So after the states issued their declarations of emergency, then you saw the mayors do the same. And then our Louisville Metro Public Health and Wellness, that's the LMPHW, all public health departments started issuing orders. First, ours issued one that said that all of our first responders had to be screened for duty. Well, that sounds simple enough until you realize that there's a shortage of thermometers because everybody was buying them up across the nation. And of course, that was followed by a shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment, and a whole bunch of other things as far as how we were going to keep our employees safe. So this started to become a real issue at the time this declaration, this order was issued, and how we're even screening our employees and how we're testing them when they become symptomatic. And then, of course, going through the order banning all mass gatherings got a lot of attention, and particularly maybe not at the time it was enacted, but certainly after that. And then just the school closures after that as well. And then what we saw next, going into the rest of March and starting to go into April, really trying to identify, and you see this on March 23rd, which became an issue for us, was what were we going to do with those people who tested positive? And what happens if they didn't want to self-quarantine? They didn't want to isolate themselves. And how are we going to deal with that? So this became an issue for us as well. But we really needed to figure out what is our plan for those folks? What is our plan to just treat people who have been exposed but may not have somewhere to go? Maybe the homeless, or maybe just their family doesn't want them in the house and they don't want to be in the house. So what do we do with those people? And how do we take care of them? And then particularly in congregate facilities with senior care and long-term care facilities, what are we supposed to do there? And do we have enough bed space? And really talking to the hospitals about what is your capacity, and do we need a field hospital? We established a field hospital at the Kentucky Fair and Exposition Center fairly early on. Ultimately, thank goodness, we ended up not needing it, but you don't know that at the time. I mean, if you watch the numbers in New York, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, this is going to exceed all capacity we might have here. The hospitals felt really good. We were in coordination with, of course, with the Norton and Baptist and U of L and others, that throughout this process, really staying on top of what is our surge capacity, what can we handle, what should we be prepared for, where is Metro government's role in all of that. And then, as you see there, extending closures to all government, well, many government services. I won't say all government services, because we had to maintain a lot of, particularly in my cabinet, a lot of services had to keep going. For example, waste management. So people still expect your trash and your recycling is going to be picked up, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the world. That's just a health issue. And on top of that, road work. So people are going to expect that we have to maintain the streets. We have to maintain the ability to be able to enable transportation. And then on top of that, our facilities, we've got to maintain our facilities. And now even more so, we've got to clean them repeatedly over and over and over again. So those people, we had a lot of folks who were not teleworking through this time. We're not allowed to telework because they're the folks who are expected to be on the really on the front edge of providing government services. And then of course, first responders, none of those folks are teleworking because they're first responders. These are our public safety elements. And as I go through the rest of that, as you see on April 2nd, talking a little bit about the commutation of sentences. I'll talk about corrections here in a moment, but how that impacted us. And just the last few executive orders I wanted to highlight here were just a few other things, particularly April 6th. What we started to see here in March was a lot of these pop-up test sites, and realized that these folks didn't get permission from the public health department. We're not sure where that data is going. And so what we saw was several of these entities come into town and just set up shop and charging a phenomenal fee for these tests that should not be getting charged. And so we had to enact an order to say, okay, if you're going to set up a testing site, here are the rules you need to play by. Here's what you need to do. And not only that, but we have to come up with a traffic plan so that the police department can take care of those folks who are wanting to get to and from those particular pop-up sites. And then, of course, the reopening orders started April 27th with Governor Beshear starting to trickle those out. And these are ongoing through today's date, just which services were reopening. This is a very phased, deliberately phased approach to reopening. And I'll talk about how we're doing that here in a moment as well. And then, of course, May 1st, we realized that we're just not ready to reopen everything yet. So the mayor extended the state of emergency for the city by another month. So if I could, while that was going on with the executive orders, the local metro government, initially in my cabinet, having emergency management responsibilities, we realized that, hey, this is a crisis and we should treat it like a crisis. And so how do we normally treat crises in government? Well, first off, what we would normally do is establish a command post, establish an emergency operations command. And we would establish something called an incident command system or structure that would take care of that. But before we even do any of that, we really needed to start that communication piece early. So the first thing I did was to organize a meeting, an internal meeting for all of our Metro directors. So all the departments across Metro, about probably 27, 28, plus all the other entities, you're talking about probably a better part of 50 folks we brought together. And on March 9th, we actually could bring them together. We brought them into the Metro Hall, but we made them sit several seats apart, but we were still bringing everybody together. By the next day, we were able to bring in our external partners. So we sent out a list of like about 100 invitees to come in, and we were able to have them do the same thing and answer questions. Look, this is what we're looking at. We wanted to share, this is how we're thinking about things. We're asking all of our departments to produce concept of operations plans, and we want them to share those plans with us, and we'd like to share those plans with you. And also hear your concerns and questions. And then on 2 days later, we did a tabletop exercise. Now, the interesting thing is that's 3 days, and already our information was outdated, because what had happened is we created this tabletop exercise with these scenarios for all of our external partners and our internal departments. And one of the scenarios was, for example, a long-term care facility, or it also fed into a scenario where we were going to hold Thunder over Louisville. And Thunder over Louisville is coming up. And we, in the scenario, had some folks test positive, but only like a couple at a long-term care facility and one traveler who was coming into the airport. Well, by this time, the news across the United States had far outpaced this scenario already. And the mayor, I remember, came to me and he said, we can't go with this scenario, this tabletop exercise. It's already moved. You know, we're already past this. We did it anyway, just to say, because we weren't quite sure what was going to happen next. We were pretty sure by this time, this mass gathering thing, this is before the governor enacted that order, but it looks like we're not going to be able to have mass gatherings to the extent that we previously thought. But nobody was sure at this point. During this 1 week period in March, we were planning for all possible scenarios. And then by that Friday, March 13th, we established this incident management team and the command post that I talked about. So what that means is that when we established the incident management team, you see right there in the middle of the screen, it's about 75 Metro employees from across all departments. We brought probably about half of them into MetroSafe, the MetroSafe facility there on 5th Street. That's considered our emergency operations command. The other half of them were teleworking. And this whole structure was led by the mayor and senior staff like me, and then our Department of Emergency Management that's led by Jody Myman. Today is actually operational day number 77 for that incident management team. And on the far right, you see some of the key elements of any incident management team. This is something that's really promoted and trained nationally. This concept, this incident command system, is trained with these key elements involved. And I'll talk about each one of those as you look at a overcomplicated org chart of the incident management team. It's not so important that you look at all the boxes in there, but I wanted you to get a feel for all those green boxes are the people who were teleworking. That makes it way different from a normal crisis. In a normal crisis, all of us would be in the same room together. We'd all be dealing with the same problem, the same crisis, sharing information, passing papers back and forth. We'd be in each other's spaces, and we would be able to really share that information at lightning speed. And here, I mean, technology is a great thing, but sometimes there's no substitute to be able to have 5 conversations going on at once in people's personal space. And so we had to come up with really kind of a new way of dealing with a crisis in this particular instance. And so all of what you see here is the way we had structured ourselves was by the different sections. We have an operations section, we have a planning section, logistics, intelligence, finance. One of the most important pieces is the Joint Information Center. Those are the people who are communicating. And this also was new to particularly me and the folks that probably come from public safety backgrounds much like me, is this dealt with everybody. So first of all, it's a public health crisis, but it's also involving everything from our resilient community services. So how do we deal with the homeless population? How do we deal with seniors? How do we deal with the long-term care facilities? How are we dealing with the business closures? And so all of those things were things we normally don't have to worry about during any given crisis. In 29 years with the FBI, I have a lot of crisis experience, but it's really geared toward the things you would expect the FBI to be involved in, which are terrorist attacks and bombings and mass shootings, chemical attacks, things of that nature. It's not a global pandemic normally. And so this was new to all of us and a huge learning curve. I called this my immersion course in local government because I've learned so much about what local government does. And I got to say, it's been really amazing to watch all the things that local government does and is expected to do during a crisis on the front lines. So I wanted to just briefly talk to you too about some of the things that the planning section was responsible for doing. Every conceivable thing that we thought, hey, this could be a problem, we asked our planning team to put together a plan for. And so they ended up producing 41 different plans. This is just a portion of those 41 plans, but this gives you a feel for what types of things we were trying to think through, whether it was the isolation enforcement that I previously talked about. What are we going to do if somebody tests positive and then they refuse to isolate at home for the requisite period of days? What do we do with those people? Are we supposed to go like ask them, nicely how many times, or do we even know that they're not doing that? And then what happens? First responder testing I talked about. Hard to reach populations. Some people they don't want to contact the government to be tested because they've had previously bad experiences with either our government or other governments from wherever they may come from. And so how are we keeping everybody safe in those environments? Industrial workers, when you don't have the luxury of being able to socially distance at work, or the luxury of being able to telework. I know it probably doesn't feel like a luxury to many of you at this point, but when you're forced to be in close contact with each other, just by the nature of your work, how are we taking care of those people? I mean, if it's a private company, then what is the role of local government in being able to dictate to that private company what they should or should not be doing when it comes to their employees, and exactly what that looks like? As you see there over on the left, I got to say, portable toilets and hand washing stations. That doesn't sound like something that would normally be a big deal, but actually it was, and the reason was it was for the homeless population, and particularly when we closed the restaurants, when we closed the libraries, when we closed the facilities that those individuals would normally use to practice basic sanitation, those were all gone. And so how do we take care of that particular population? So this became a big deal, things that I wouldn't have thought about. I wouldn't have thought about that. And the reason I laugh a little bit is because I told a friend of mine when she asked back at the FBI headquarters, she said, how's it going? And I said, I've learned more about portable toilets in the past 2 weeks, I told her, than I ever imagined possible. But these are things that, again, you just don't really think about until we're in the middle of all of this. And the last plan on the right, the demobilization, we also had to figure out what is our exit strategy for this whole incident management team? You know, at what point does it end? Because clearly COVID's going to be around for a while, but at some point we've got to not only start to scale back a little bit. There for the first 45 days, it was nonstop. It was every day, 7 days a week. It was, you know, at least for a lot of us, it was on-site, hands-on type of interactions. And so at what point do we start to scale back the 7 phone calls a day, conference calls a day, down to something more manageable, and give my people a little bit of a break so that they could feel some sense of normality. They could still see their families and have some sense of life and de-stress a bit. So I'd talk about just a minute on public safety response, and particularly the things that fall under my cabinet, including now the police. I just wanted to review some of the things that were happening in these particular agencies. And so I just thought this was of interest for any data geeks out there like myself. From March 1st to just the other day, 2 days ago, to May 25th, so in this period of time of almost 3 months, we made about 28,000 runs, but this is emergency medical services. These are the ambulances, the paramedics, the EMTs. That's actually down from last year. And 6.3% is a pretty sizable decrease from last year. Now, the types of runs were about the same as what we saw last year at this time. But if you notice, there are the biggest increases in what we saw and what we're looking at. You know, burns. I mean, if you think about this and you think about each one of those things, is that, okay, why did burns increase? Well, probably because people were spending more time at home and doing things they probably shouldn't have been doing, and touching things they probably shouldn't have been doing, maybe home projects or other things. Stabbings and shootings. Look at the significant increase there of 32%. Now that's contradictory to what we saw in cities in other parts of the nation where they actually had a decrease in violent crime during this period. So why did we have an increase and yet other cities had a decrease? This is very interesting data to try to parse this out, to try to figure this out here. Poisoning, I put that sort of in the same category of, you know, people spending too much time at home bored. And so again, this is just the types of things we had to respond to. Breathing, that makes sense. Is that because with all the emphasis on COVID and people having breathing issues, whether they had COVID or whether they didn't, it still, you know, rose to that attention. But one particular thing right underneath that I want to bring your attention to is the refusals. So refusals is when someone, you call an ambulance, but you refuse to allow that ambulance to take you to the hospital. So what we saw was an 11% increase in refusals in March and April. And the reason was because people were afraid to go to the hospital. And really that was concerning because they were worried they were going to go to the hospital where positive COVID patients were being housed, and they didn't want to be in that environment. They didn't want to expose themselves. So they would refuse to be taken to the hospital. They would refuse medical treatment at that point. So clearly this was of great concern to us too. And one other concern was, I don't know if anybody noticed, but the streets were pretty empty. I know my daily commute to and from work got a lot easier, but I also saw a lot of people who apparently decided to test their speedometers and see just how fast that new vehicle could go. And a lot of reckless driving, unfortunately, ensued as a result of fewer people on the street. And we had 2 fatal accidents, unfortunately, involving 2 of our ambulances in the same week. It was a matter of fact 3 days apart. I mean, it was people unfortunately running red lights, or just unfortunately just unsafe practices, and in both instances people died. And what we were trying to get across was, hey, just because it looks like nobody's on the roads, we've got to be very aware of our surroundings, and emergency vehicles in particular. With fire, the interesting thing about fire was that actually there wasn't a lot of change from last year. It was 4% down from last year, but that's not as much as emergency management, emergency services, and the same types of runs that we saw last year. The increases just a little bit. I mean, you see 68 to 72. That's only four more, but still a little bit of an increase, and a few more fires. But you see, of course, the rescues and the hazards. Those are things we didn't have to respond to as much because, again, people just weren't getting out as much. And then the police department. Now, this is kind of interesting, but 12% decrease in the number of runs from this time last year. And the most common and the biggest increase was directed activity. So what that means is when somebody calls something in specifically, it's not part of a regular patrol, it's not part of a regular route, but it's some type of directed activity where they're told to, hey, we need you to check out this this type of activity on this date. Too many people congregated at the basketball court, or too many people who are drag racing. That type of directed activity is the type of thing that we saw skyrocket during this time. And once again, shots fired, shootings, stabbings, those things increased in our city during this time as opposed to other cities. And then, of course, loud party music, as you would expect, that increased as well. And what we saw decrease were the types of things that you would also expect. Fewer cars on the road, so fewer hits and runs, fewer calls to handle traffic, and of course, with the notices, the executive orders to not evict people during this time, then of course we saw fewer enforcement of those types of orders and eviction notices. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes on corrections. So with corrections, we started off on February 1st, just before, a couple days before I took this job, with 1,931, that we call it in-bed population. Those are the inmates who are there overnight, incarcerated overnight, at either the main jail or the community correctional facility. And so 1,931 exceeds our capacity. That's that's overcrowding. Now, what has happened because of the different orders to either commute sentences or to release individuals or to take other measures that the courts have taken, that the governor has taken, to be able to ensure that people, either nonviolent offenders, are expedited for release, or that people who can't afford bail, it's not a reason to keep them in jail, but also a variety of other reasons with the closures of courts and many other factors contributed to this 33% decline in our in-bed population. So now we're down to 1,297. That was as of yesterday. And as a result of that, what we were able to do was to transfer we were down to about 65 staff and about 45 inmates. That was way down on May 4th, but realizing that it was more cost effective and really safer to move those individuals over to the main jail. So we closed the Community Corrections Facility Center on May 4th and did that. Now, testing has become a big topic in jails across the country. And so what we wanted to do is engage in very robust, very aggressive testing of not only our inmate population, but our staff. As I talked about first responder testing earlier, but of our 514 approximately correctional staff, we have tested about 32% of those. That's really good, actually, compared to most other cities and really all other departments within Metro government. But we've had about 25 positive as a result of that testing of our staff. And what that means is every time somebody tests positive, it means not only is that person off work for a designated period of time, but also the people around them. So the people who they had direct contact with, and watching particularly those individuals to see if they exhibit any signs or symptoms and seeing how long that may take. So you're talking about every correctional officer who tests positive has a ripple effect on now many corrections officers who were taken offline and unable to do their jobs during this time. So that's another reason why we transferred those staff from the Community Correction Center over to the main jail. And then as far as the inmates go, when we started to see things happening, like what happened at Green River Correctional Facility, where and other cities, Chicago or in Ohio, we saw phenomenal rates of positive inmates. And we wanted to test ours as quickly as possible, even though we didn't see really any symptomatic folks in there among that population. Matter of fact, the first one we got was a homeless individual who refused to self-isolate. So he tested positive while he was on the outside. He refused to quarantine himself. First off, he didn't, of course, he's homeless. He doesn't have a home, but we wanted him to stay at, we established a facility for homeless positive patients at Kinjoy with Salvation Army. And this individual just basically refused to stay at that location. So we had to put him somewhere. We arrested him, if you will. We put him in custody. And because of the order of the public health department, he can't be going around and spreading this to other people. So we put him in isolation in the jail. We have 4 negative pressure cells there that enable an individual there to not infect other individuals. And so we were doing pretty good for that. He was actually released once he went through the quarantine period. And then at that point, we were really ramping up our testing, and we started to get a few tests that came back positive. But even to date, we've tested 64% of our inmates and only 9 positive. That's a phenomenally low rate. And I give a big shout out to the folks inside corrections, to Director Clark and his people for staying on top of that, practicing all kinds of things. And I'll show you on the next slide. But the other thing we saw is that there were no transfers of inmates during this time period. So the governor issued a no transfer order and said that essentially we shouldn't be transferring inmates between facilities during this crisis. And so what normally happens is that state inmates, people who are facing state charges, would be, even though they might be in our custody for a short time, the state is normally supposed to pick them up within 45 days and transfer them to a state facility if they have the beds available. But in this case, there was a lockdown order. So what you see there in that chart is that gray line shows you the increase in the number of state inmates that we normally would have transferred out during this time. And right now we've got over 200, a little over 200 state inmates that we're housing at the moment who would normally be in state custody. And again, my shout out to corrections. This just shows you some of the steps that were taken. I mean, they thought of everything that they could possibly think of that they could do, because you have a setting that is not conducive to being able to socially distance. But yet they try to think of all ways we could possibly make it as safe as possible. Everything from eliminating haircuts to gym time to, and some of these, I mean, they're not fun. I mean, you take away, visitation. But now granted, we don't have in-person visitation to begin with, but just the video visitation required visitors to congregate inside the Hall of Justice, in the basement of the Hall of Justice. We didn't want that to happen, so we canceled visitation. We also established that deep cleaning crews were going to go through and clean everything. We had inmates helping out with that. We mandated masks, face coverings to be worn by all staff and issued them to all inmates as well. And then established free phone calls to make up for the lack of visitation, and the programs that are done at the jail. We had to cancel those types of things, religious services or any type of services where people come in and really prompt people to come together. We canceled those in order to make that not happen. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the reopening plan. So as we started to look at what would reopen and when, the governor issued several orders. Back on April 28th was where Governor Beshear announced the 10 rules to reopening. He called it a healthy at work plan. And it talked about things like having temperature checks, face coverings, and maintaining social distancing. And so we used that as a template, as well as after that, the governor's office issued the requirements for government offices and agencies. And that was supposed to be effective May 18th. And it covered same kinds of things: social distancing, cleaning and disinfecting, what type of PPE you're wearing, training and safety. And so we came up based on that with our own guidance for our own departments and for the tenants of our facilities. So for example, the courts or the clerk's office, how they were going about doing business. Granted, they don't report to the mayor, but at the same time, they reside in our facilities, they work in our facilities, metro facilities, and so we had to ensure that they were engaging in safe practices and look at their plans and do walkthroughs of their plans. So we required all of our departments, as well as all the tenants of our facilities, to produce plans, to respond to surveys, to tell us what they needed, whether it was plexiglass or thermometers or PPE or signage, whatever it might be. And we needed to review those plans and walk through it with our safety people, with our facilities people, with our public health, with all of the individuals you might expect that would have a role in making sure we are not given a thumbs up if they don't deserve a thumbs up on ready to reopen. And one of the key things that we sent out was, of course, lots of communication, lots and lots of communication. So as we pushed this out to all of our departments, we told people, hey, look, this is not a shotgun start. When we reopen, it's not like everybody's going to flood back in. You can't just open the doors and bring everybody back. So if the positions you have that are teleworking successfully, let them continue to telework successfully. There are a lot of lessons learned here. Physicians returning to work have to follow these guidelines, the temperature checks, daily health questionnaire, and the face covering policy, and then maintaining social distancing. You see the signage that our folks created for all of our facilities, and then making accommodations for people who are in high risk categories. And then finally, this is, of course, the mayor's Build Back Better Together strategy and how we will reopen our economy, and the plans in place for that just started to form, and matter of fact, made the news yesterday, steering committees for different focus groups for these different aspects of reopening local, and how we're going to go about doing that safely, how we're going to do that hopefully even better, because now lessons learned, we have this great opportunity here to really make it even better than it was as we start to bring things back online. But I got to say in closing is that I don't see that we will really maybe ever return to what we refer to as normal. It's not going to look the same as it did on February 1st or 3rd when I took this job. But we do have an opportunity to establish a new and better normal. And so lessons learned, things that we can do, we can do it effectively from this process. I had a reporter ask me the other day, said, don't you think that it'll just all go back to normal like it did after 9/11, the attacks on 9/11? And I said, did things go back to normal after 9/11? Because have you flown through an airport before and after 9/11? That didn't go back to normal. Things will change, but not necessarily in a bad way. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Amy, thank you very, very much. We have a lot of questions here, some really good ones. And let me get my screen in position here. Okay. The first question has to do with, this is from Larry Stone. And Larry starts off by saying, Amy, thank you for your service. Some good things have come out of this pandemic. In Larry's opinion, one of those things is the closure of park roads to vehicular traffic. And Larry says that every time that he walks or bikes around the loop in Cherokee Park, it's full of walkers, runners, and families enjoying the park safely. And he'd like to know, is it possible to see this particular change made permanent?
Yeah, you know what? One of the interesting things that, which I thought was great to see, is that when the roads were closed, we talked about this a lot as to whether or not that would limit access, and what the ramifications of that are. Some people aren't able to get around obviously as much as others, and some people they use those roads as throughways to get from one part of the city to another. But what closing the roads did was it actually encouraged people to get out more and made people feel safer in the parks. And I know that I particularly saw in the parks a huge increase in the amount of activity, which was great to see. There's a lot of discussion about how we reopen. I don't have an answer at this moment, but definitely point taken is that it has been great to see people get out and enjoy the parks so much. And now as we start to reopen things, so start to reopen the tennis courts, and at some point we'll reopen the basketball courts and reopen the other things as part of parks. And we're reopening the Mary T. Maher Aquatic Center and other places like that, starting to reopen the zoo. As we start to see those things come back online, what can we do safely, still hopefully encouraging and maintaining social distancing? And then what things may become permanent.
Great, appreciate that. The next question is from Ken Grossman, and Ken also says, thank you for your service. I think most people did say that, so I'm not going to say it again, but I know we all do appreciate your service. Ken would like to know, basically, is what planning is in place or being done for Thunder over Louisville and also for the Derby? And also, do you anticipate at this point in time that the Derby will have spectators?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the $1 million question right now.
Right,
and
right. And we're going to hold you to it.
I was just going to say, it really is that everybody wants things to come back online, but we also recognize that all the public health experts, all the health experts tell us that we're still a ways away from a vaccine. And really, that means that we've got to balance what types of events, what type of services, what types of things we do that put people at risk the most, whether or not it's worth it to expose people in that way. And of course, every city is different. The timing is different. The temperature can make a difference, or the part of the nation that you're in could make a difference. What type of setting you're in at home makes a difference. And we all recognize that everybody's in a different situation. But I think the responsibility of government is to try to keep people as safe as possible while still encouraging people to get out. So with that said, I think it's going to be, personally, I think it's going to be real difficult to hold an event like Thunder over Louisville. I think it's a much easier prospect to think of things like the Kentucky Derby with no fans, or maybe with limited fans in the stands, and be able to space people out, because that's a much more controlled environment where you can keep people apart perhaps a little easier than you could in a situation like Thunder. But then again, all bets are still on right at the moment, so to speak. That remains to be seen what we can do safely and as we go through all this.
Okay, great, thank you. One other question from Ken has to do with testing for the general population. And he asks, is the goal for everyone to be tested? And do you recommend that everyone be tested? What do you feel, what's appropriate?
Yeah, we have said for the longest time now that unless you have symptoms, unless you're symptomatic, then really those are the people we want to prioritize for testing. Because those are the individuals that we wanted to catch first. But now what we've realized is, in particular, I use the jail as my example, is that those 9 inmates that I said have tested positive since we started really testing were all asymptomatic. They didn't show any signs. And so we realized that there are carriers out there, and we kind of need to know, who they are, so that we know also where they've been and who they have been exposed to, who've been exposed to them. And that goes into several things, which is contact tracing. So you may have heard about this in the news, and we're ramping up a huge effort on contact tracing. It will be interesting to see how this rolls out across the country. But the idea being that the sooner we can figure out who the positive people are and who they've come into contact with, so that we can figure out where exactly those pockets are, so we can direct testing to those locations and tell those people that, hey, you need to isolate, you need to stay at home, you need to quarantine, then the better off we'll be, because we're able to then control, if you will, we're able to control the spread in the meantime while we're trying to find this vaccine. And so what I would say is that certainly, if it gives you comfort, now we have way more testing capacity than we did just even, a few weeks ago. now we're seeing robust testing everywhere. And so I would say that by all means, if it makes you feel comfortable, even if you're asymptomatic, to get a test. But particularly if you have signs and symptoms, that's when I would highly recommend you take advantage of those services.
Okay, very good. Another question related to the COVID-19 issue, and that is, this is from Denise Sears, and she explains that there are some concerns for a fall spike and what steps are being taken to ensure that Lowell is prepared to respond if in fact a fall spike occurs.
Yeah, so that goes into our incident management team. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of our team for doing is keeping all the documentation of what we've done in this process that we've learned so much in the past 3 months to be able to reestablish it quickly, but to reestablish it even better, because now we have the experience of having gone through this. We know what worked, what didn't work. As a matter of fact, I was just on a call this morning talking about doing an after action review, which seems a little odd to people because they're like, well, we're not out of the crisis yet. COVID is still, rampant. Why are you doing an after action review as if it's over? It's because we need to take lessons learned from really the peak of the crisis that we've just experienced, because we do anticipate as more things come online, we will see more cases. And so we don't expect that curve, if you will, to continue to decrease. What we anticipate, it'll decrease for a while, but now as things come back online, we'll see a resurgence. And the question is, how much of a resurgence? Will it prompt us to have to take really extreme measures to re-implement the structure we had in place?
Sure. We'll close with a couple of questions related to public safety. This question comes from Julie Schmidt, and Julie would like to know, excuse me, given your background in dealing with gangs, she'd like to know what your perspective might be about the impact of gangs in Lowell at the present time, and do you see this as an area of focus?
I do. I mean, of course, like I said, what's fascinating really to me is having a history in criminal criminal investigations, and particularly working gangs and working drugs in the past, is that activity seemed to increase here. The stabbings, the shootings, the violence that results from it actually increased here as opposed to other cities. Other cities have gangs. Other cities have groups of people who, had major violent crime problems before COVID, and now they didn't. Why is that? That fascinates me as to what was happening in those cities that wasn't happening here, or vice versa. So this is definitely an area of focus, and particularly how we go about identifying who those individuals are who are, continuing to engage in this activity, and what do we do to give them alternatives? What do we give to, what do we do to, as a society? It's not just a law enforcement problem, it's clearly a society problem, to try to give them alternatives.
Very good. This last question came from about 2 or 3 different people. And the question is, if offered, would you consider the position of LMPD chief? I know that's been in the media.
Yeah, I know it has. I got to say, as of course, I'm honored to be considered for such a prestigious position, and I definitely had a good working relationship with Steve Conrad when I was the head of the FBI office here, and of course a lot of great people in that police department. What I think personally is that a police department and a city are best served by someone who has been a police officer, somebody who has experienced policing, from the patrolman level up. Now, granted, 29 years in the FBI, I know the FBI. I've been around police officers my whole career, and I've been on a lot of task forces. But I got to say, it's still not the same thing as being a patrol officer, of actually being out there and doing that, and what comes with that. So granted, I have the utmost respect for police across the nation, but I also recognize that police departments need to do more to engage the community, to relate to the community. My biggest fear, quite frankly, when it comes to police departments and federal law enforcement for that matter, is a dividing chasm between them and the communities they serve. And so if that happens, then police are ineffective and will be. And we need somebody to bridge that gap, to close that chasm.
Good. Very, very good. Thank you so much. I think I speak for the entire club when we say thanks for all of the work that you're doing on this. Candidly, I've learned a lot today. I think a lot of us as citizens probably take for granted all the things that take place behind the scenes on the part of Metro. And I think you really illustrated how this goes across all departments. And so I think all of us really appreciate not only what you're doing, but all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of Metro employees dealing with this issue. And hopefully we'll be back to normal, or some semblance of normal, sooner rather than later. So thanks again. With that, we're going to conclude the meeting. It's just about 1 o'clock. A quick reminder to the Rotarians, keep an eye for your emails about upcoming activities and next week's meeting. And also, if you haven't done so already, please consider and make your donation to the Rotary Matching Gifts Fund. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Thanks, Amy.